The daylight felt like heaven, though I saw at first glance that the sun was all but set, and that was bad, since I couldn't live outside my thermoskin bag in a Martian night, at least without a fire. And things got worse in a hurry. They cornered us in an angle between two mounds, and there we stood. I hadn't fired, nor had Tweel. There wasn't any use in irritating the brutes. They stopped a little distance away and began their booming about friendship and ouches. Then things got still worse. A barrel brute came out with a pushcart, and they all grabbed into it and came out with handfuls of foot-long copper darts, sharp-looking ones, and all of a sudden, one sailed past my ear. Zing! And it was shoot or die then. We were doing pretty well for a while. We picked off the ones next to the pushcart and managed to keep the darts at a minimum, but suddenly there was a thunderous booming of "Vrens" and "ouches," and a whole army of them came out of their hole. A Martian Odyssey was written in 1934 by Stanley G. Weinbaum, almost 100 years ago now. At the time, we had a completely different view of Mars. Humanity believed that it might have a thin but breathable atmosphere, which is why you find this in many older Mars sci-fi stories. Back then, we had no clue how big the universe really is, or how desolate it is. Many dreamed of life on Mars, and in the late 19th century, most likely due to the processes they used to make the telescope lenses at the time, maybe combined with a bit of wishful thinking, it appeared people had discovered canals on Mars, and canals are built not just by life, but by intelligent life. So people's imaginations went wild, and you can find several stories about them written during this period of sci-fi. Later it was discovered that there were no canals, despite multiple people at the time even going so far as to make maps of the canals, none of which matched each other's drawings, by the way. It was just an optical illusion, caused by scratches and imperfections, magnified by the other lenses. But if it bothers you that this story is set in a Mars that never was, just tell yourself it's on another alien planet. Nothing about this story requires that it be set on Mars. All the other facts still work. This crew of humans is further from Earth than any other before them. They are the first humans to set foot on another planet with a breathable atmosphere. And one of them has an amazing adventure. Now, before we get into it, I just want to mention one other thing. We didn't have the atomic bomb in 1934. So let me read you an opening section that I found very interesting. Dick Jarvis was chemist of the famous crew, the Ares expedition, first human beings to set foot on the mysterious neighbor of the Earth, the planet Mars. This, of course, was in the old days, less than 20 years after the mad American Doheny perfected the atomic blast at the cost of his life, and only a decade after the equally mad Cardoza rode on it to the moon. They were true pioneers, these four of the Ares. Except for the half-dozen moon expeditions and the ill-fated Delancey flight aimed at the seductive orb of Venus, they were the first men to feel other gravity than the Earth's, and certainly the first successful crew to leave the Earth-Moon system. When I first read this, I thought he was talking about the atomic bomb, but it had not been invented yet. The atomic blast, he calls it, but it says someone rode it to the moon? Well, in this universe, humanity developed an atomic engine, one safe enough to use on Earth, one that works in space or in atmosphere and is powerful enough to fly a spaceship to the moon or Mars. So the timeline they laid out was that the first engine was perfected. Then, 10 years later, people used it to go to the moon, and 10 years after that, to Mars. Now, to any of you history buffs out there, you know that none of this ever happened, and we went to the moon on brute force chemical rockets. And over 30 years later, we still have not made it to Mars, nor even returned to the moon recently. Anyway, I thought that was interesting, so now, on to the story. Even before the crew of the Ares landed on the planet's surface, they flew over what appeared to be canals and mud cities. But their landing zone was already predetermined, and they were not going to deviate from the plan. So they landed and set up camp as if they had seen nothing. They were not surprised by the canals. They had been spotted by telescopes a century ago, and repeatedly confirmed ever since. Even the mud cities had been seen, so they continued on with the plan. The next day after landing, 2 men took out small exploration craft that would fly at a low altitude above the ground. One went north, the other south, both mapping the terrain. Jarvis had gone south. He had traveled for 8 hours and hit his turnaround point 800 miles south of the landing site when his engine died and his craft dropped out of the sky. Thankfully, he had only been going around 100 kilometers per hour at the time, and the soft sand that covered the majority of the planet's surface cushioned the impact enough to make it survivable. For Jarvis, the ship, on the other hand, was damaged beyond repair. This planet did have thinner air, but that was because it was less massive than the Earth, and therefore had lighter gravity as well. So Jarvis considered his options. He could stay with the wrecked ship and hope for rescue, or he could walk 800 miles back to base. He figured he would stand out enough on the surface that it wouldn't matter if he was with his ship or not, so he decided that walking was the best idea. It wouldn't decrease his chances of being found, and it would drastically increase his chances of saving himself if it came down to it. So off he began, carrying a large water tank on his back, a rifle over his shoulder, and a pack of all the food he could carry. Luckily, in the lower gravity, even carrying all this, he still weighed less than his dry weight on Earth. Only a day into his travels, he heard a strange sound, somewhat bird-like, definitely panicked. As he came over a dune, he found an ostrich-like creature, being attacked by dark tentacles coming out of the ground. Jarvis was considering just watching the battle to see the results, when he noticed that the ostrich had a pack around its neck. It was either sentient or belonged to something that was. So Jarvis pulled up his rifle and shot the black creature. The tentacles sucked back into a hole in the ground. The ostrich creature rolled away from its attacker and stood up, looking at Jarvis. Jarvis held his gun ready until the creature threw its hands up towards Jarvis in what appeared to be a signal that it was both unarmed and thankful. Jarvis, not sensing any hostility from it, put his rifle away. The creature seemed sentient and intelligent. Jarvis tried for quite a while to communicate with it. Well, we stared at the fire a while, and I decided to attempt some sort of communication with the Martian. I pointed at myself and said, "Dick." He caught the drift immediately, stretched a bony claw at me and repeated, "Tick." Then I pointed at him, and he gave that whistle I called tweel. I can't imitate his accent. Things were going smoothly. To emphasize the names, I repeated, "Dick," and then, pointing at him, "Tweel." There we stuck. He gave some clacks that sounded negative and said something like, "Paproot." And that was just the beginning. I was always Tick, but as for him, part of the time he was Tweel, and part of the time he was Paproot, and part of the time he was 16 other noises. We just couldn't connect. I tried rock, and I said star, and tree, and fire, and Lord knows what else, and try as I would, I couldn't get a single word. Nothing was the same for 2 successive minutes. And if that's a language, I'm an alchemist. Finally, I gave it up and called him Tweel, and that seemed to do. But Tweel hung on to some of my words. He remembered a couple of them, which I suppose is a great achievement if you're used to languages you have to make up as you go along. But I couldn't get the hang of his talk. Either I missed some subtle point, or we just didn't think alike, and I rather believe the latter view. Tweel seemed better able to understand Jarvis than vice versa, and his vocal cords were far more versatile, so he learned how to speak a few words. He also didn't seem to sleep, and was not affected by the cold at night. While Jarvis, on the other hand, was exhausted from each day's traveling, and was forced to hide inside his thermal sleeping bag all night, or else face near-instant frostbite in the far sub-zero environment. Tweel seemed to have become a loyal friend of Jarvis's, however, and never left him. He seemed to just wait all night for Jarvis, then continue on with him the next day. He carried several tools on himself. He had a chemical pistol, fired by mixing some strange substance with water. It would fire out glass shards that seemed to be poisoned in some way. He also had what looked like a glowing coal, but it did not burn Tweel when he handled it, despite easily setting flame to anything else it touched. Jarvis was beginning to wonder who was actually more advanced, him or Tweel. As they traveled together, they came across what appeared to be hollow glass balls being blown across the sand. Jarvis grabbed one and cracked it open. All that came out was a strange smell. Tweel pointed at them and said one of the few words he knew, "Rock." But Jarvis was too tired from walking all day to argue with him about it. Their next strange discovery was a row of tiny hollow pyramids, with their tops all broken off, stretching in a line, each one larger than the next. But the first one, only a few centimeters tall, was very weathered, something that takes much longer in this thin, dry atmosphere than it does on Earth. They could reasonably have been carved 500,000 years ago. Jarvis indicated the pyramids to Tweel and asked if he knew what they were. All he said was, "Rock," which Jarvis already knew. So the pair followed the line of pyramids that extended on into the distance. They continued to grow in size until they were large enough for a person to live inside. Jarvis pointed at himself and at Tweel, then at the pyramids, and asked if they were made by a civilized people, like the two of them. Tweel replied with, "No 112, no 224. Jarvis didn't understand at first, but as they walked he began to figure it out. Whoever or whatever made these buildings was not sentient like they were, and when they finally came to the end of the line, he knew he was right. The queer part was that the last one, and now they were 10-footers, was capped. See, whatever built it was still inside. We trailed them from their 500,000-year-old origins to the present. Tweel and I noticed it at about the same time. I yanked out my automatic. I had a clip of Boland explosive bullets in it, and Tweel, quick as a sleight of hand trick, snapped a queer little glass revolver out of his bag. It was much like our weapons, except the grip was larger to accommodate his 4-taloned hand, and we held our weapons ready while we sneaked up along the lines of empty pyramids. Tweel saw the movement first. The top tiers of bricks were heaving, shaking, and suddenly slid down the sides with a thin crash, and then something was coming out. A long, silvery gray arm appeared, dragging after it an armored body. Armored, I mean with scales, silver gray and dull shining. The arm heaved the body out of the hole. The beast crashed to the sand. It was a nondescript creature, body like a big gray cask, arm and a sort of mouth hole at one end, stiff, pointed tail at the other, and that's all. No other limbs, no eyes, ears, nose, nothing. The thing dragged itself a few yards, inserted its pointed tail in the sand, pushed itself upright, and just sat. Tweel and I watched it for 10 minutes before it moved. Then, with a creaking and rustling like crumpling stiff paper, its arm moved to the mouth hole, and out came a brick. The arm placed the brick carefully on the ground, and the thing was still again. Another 10 minutes. Another brick. Just one of nature's bricklayers. I was about to slip away and move on when Tweel pointed at the thing and said, "Rock." I went, "Huh?" And he said it again. Then, to the accompaniment of some of his trilling, he said, "No, no," and gave 2 or 3 whistling breaths. Well, I got his meaning, for a wonder. I said, "No breath?" and demonstrated the word. Tweel was ecstatic. He said, "Yes, yes, yes, no, no breet, no breet." And then he gave a leap and sailed out to land on his nose, about 1 pace from the monster. I was startled, you can imagine. The arm was going up for a brick, and I expected to see Tweel caught and mangled, but nothing happened. Tweel pounded on the creature, and the arm took the brick and placed it neatly beside the first. Tweel rapped on his body again and said, "Rock," and I got up nerve enough to take a look myself. Tweel was right again. The creature was rock, and it didn't breathe. After leaving the pyramid building beast, they again made camp, and Jarvis again hid in his sleeping bag while Tweel folded himself up to look like a local bush all night. The next day was all travel and pain and anger at not being found yet. Where the hell were his crewmates? He had only gone in a straight line. They continued on until they came across their first canal, but Jarvis was too tired and annoyed to care. He just wanted to get back home. He was busy dreaming of a girl he left behind back on Earth when suddenly he saw her on the banks of the canal. There she was, in person, smiling and waving to him. But that was impossible. There were only 4 people on the Ares, and they were the first to ever make it to this planet. And none of them were Fancy Long, the woman standing before him right now. Jarvis started to walk over to her when Tweel grabbed his arm and stopped him. "No Breet," he said, pointing at Fancy Long. Jarvis was confused. He knew Fancy couldn't be here, but there she was, with Tweel now pointing his gun at her. He wanted to stop Tweel, but instead, he just watched as Tweel carefully aimed at and shot Fancy Long. Instantly, Fancy turned into one of the black tentacle creatures that had been trying to eat Tweel when Jarvis first found him. Well, now Jarvis knew how Tweel was caught in the first place. The beast must be able to read minds and show you what you desire. Luckily, it either messed up with Tweel this time and showed him something wrong, or more likely, it can only project one form at a time, and so all Tweel saw was Fancy Long, which for obvious reasons was not enticing to him. Jarvis would have to watch out for things that were too good to be true. If he had been thinking of being rescued instead of Fancy Long, who knows how that would have turned out? Could the creature project the image of a rescue ship landing? They followed the canals to a mud city that Jarvis had seen while flying out. He was hoping for maybe some civilization, maybe a form of transportation. Anything would help, even a soft bed. As they neared the city, however, they encountered what looked like barrels with tentacles coming out of them, which were used as arms and legs. They had eyes lining the upper perimeter of the barrel, and they were all pushing carts around. Some were leaving the city with empty carts, the others coming back with full carts. Jarvis tried to communicate with them, but they had no interest in him at all. And when he would get in their way, they would beat on their flat heads like a drum and say, "Friend," and then move around him and go on with their business. Finally, Jarvis got annoyed and refused to let one pass. So when saying "Friend" didn't work, it reached out and twisted his nose, to which he quite sensibly said, "Ouch," which the barrel then repeated. Now every time he encountered one, it said, "Friend, ouch." Jarvis could make no sense of what they were doing, so he followed them back to their city. Tweel reluctantly followed, but tried to tell him, "They 112 yes, 224 no." Which at first Jarvis thought meant that these creatures were of limited intelligence, but as they continued to explore the mud city, he began to have a different thought. Maybe Tweel meant that they did not have the same logic that we do, because their civilization was clearly very complex and enigmatic. Jarvis found an entrance to their underground city, and seeing what looked to be artificial lights coming out of the lower chambers, he entered. But when he got to the light, all he found was a pile of glowing sand. The two turned to leave, but either the chambers had changed or they had already gotten lost. They could not find their way out, and Tweel was just as lost as Jarvis. Who knows how long they were lost down there? The temperature and light never changed, and eventually Jarvis needed to sleep. All they found as they explored were hallways and tunnels. Here and there they would find a machine with no discernible purpose. Finally, they came to a room with a wheel in it. There was a sort of machine in the chamber, Just an enormous wheel that turned slowly, and one of the creatures was in the act of dumping his rubbish below it. The wheel ground it with a crunch. Sand, stone, plants, all turned into powder that sifted away somewhere. While we watched, others filed in, repeating the process, and that seemed to be all. No rhyme nor reason to the whole thing. But that's characteristic of this crazy planet. And there was another fact that's almost too bizarre to believe. One of the creatures, having dumped his load, pushed his cart aside with a crash and calmly shoved himself under the wheel. I watched him being crushed, too stupefied to make a sound. And a moment later, another followed him. They were perfectly methodical about it too. One of the cartless creatures took the abandoned pushcart. Tweel didn't seem surprised. I pointed out the next suicide to him, and he just gave the most human-like shrug imaginable, as if to say, "What can I do about it?" He must have known more or less about these creatures. Then I saw something else. There was something beyond the wheel, something shining on a sort of low pedestal. I walked over. There was a little crystal about the size of an egg, fluorescing to beat Tophet. The light from it stung my hands and face, almost like a static discharge, and then I noticed another funny thing. Remember that wart I had on my left thumb? Look! Jarvis extended his hand. It dried up and fell off just like that. And my abused nose? Say the pain went out of it like magic. The thing had a property of hard X-rays or gamma radiation, only more so. It destroyed diseased tissue and left healthy tissue unharmed. I was thinking what a present that'd be to take back to Mother Earth, when a lot of racket interrupted. We dashed back to the other side of the wheel in time to see one of the pushcarts ground up. Some suicide had been careless, it seemed. Then suddenly, the creatures were booming and drumming all around us, and their noise was decidedly menacing. A crowd of them advanced towards us. We backed out of what I thought was the passage we'd entered by, and they came rumbling after us, some pushing carts and some not. Crazy brutes. There was a whole chorus of, "We are friends! Ouch!" I didn't like the ouch. It was rather suggestive. Tweel had his glass gun out, and I dumped my water tank for greater freedom and got mine. We backed up the corridor, with the barrel beasts following, about 20 of them. Queer thing, the ones coming in with loaded carts moved past us inches away without a sign. Tweel must have noticed that. Suddenly, he snatched out that glowing coal cigar lighter of his and touched a cartload of plant limbs. Puff! The whole load was burning, and the crazy beast pushing it went right along without a change of pace. It created some disturbance among our friends, however, and then I noticed the smoke eddying and swirling past us, and sure enough, there was the entrance. I grabbed Tweel and out we dashed, and after us, our 20 pursuers. The daylight felt like heaven, though I saw at first glance that the sun was all but set, and that was bad, since I couldn't live outside my thermoskin bag in a Martian night, at least without a fire. And things got worse in a hurry. They cornered us in an angle between two mounds, and there we stood. I hadn't fired, nor had Tweel. There wasn't any use in irritating the brutes. They stopped a little distance away and began their booming about friendship and ouches. Then things got still worse. A barrel brute came out with a pushcart, and they all grabbed into it and came out with handfuls of foot-long copper darts, sharp-looking ones, and all of a sudden, one sailed past my ear. Zing! And it was shoot or die then. We were doing pretty well for a while. We picked off the ones next to the pushcart and managed to keep the darts at a minimum, but suddenly, there was a thunderous booming of friends and ouches, and a whole army of them came out of their hole. Man, we were through and I knew it. Then I realized that Tweel wasn't. He could have leapt the mound behind us as easily as not. He was staying for me. Say, I could have cried if there'd been time. I liked Tweel from the first, but whether I'd have had the gratitude to do what he was doing? Suppose I had saved him from the first dream beast. He'd done as much for me, hadn't he? I grabbed his arm and said, "Tweel," and pointed up, and he understood. He said, "No, no, no, Tick," and popped away with his glass pistol. What could I do? I'd be a goner anyway when the sun set, but I couldn't explain that to him. I said, "Thanks, Tweel, you're a man." and I felt that I wasn't paying him any compliment at all. A man? There are mighty few men who'd do that. So I went bang with my gun, and Tweel went puff with his, and the barrels were throwing darts and getting ready to rush us, and booming about being friends. I had given up hope. Then suddenly, an angel dropped right down from heaven in the shape of Putz, with his underjets blasting the barrels into very small pieces. Wow! I let out a yell and dashed for the rocket. Putz opened the door and in I went, laughing and crying and shouting. It was a moment or so before I remembered Tweel. I looked around in time to see him rising in one of his nosedives over the mound and away. I had a devil of a job arguing Putz into following. By the time we got the rocket aloft, darkness was down. You know how it comes here, like turning off a light. We sailed out over the desert and put down once or twice. I yelled, "Tweel!" and yelled it 100 times, I guess. We couldn't find him. He could travel like the wind, and all I got, or else I imagined it, was a faint trilling and twittering drifting out of the south. He'd gone, and damn it, I wish he hadn't. The foremen of the Ares were silent, even the sardonic Harrison. At last, little Leroy broke the stillness.
I should like to see.
Yeah, and the wart cure. Too bad you missed that.
Oh, that, muttered Jarvis gloomily. That's what started the whole fight. He drew the glistening object from his pocket. Here it is. Hey, thanks for watching. I really appreciate you staying this long, and since you did, hopefully that means you like my channel. So I'd really appreciate it if you would like, comment, and most importantly, subscribe, so I can see you back here for the next one. Take care.